So we were talking about the challenges of how parents can help their kids with these academic pressures without overparenting. And as we go back to our cognitive triad, we're first going to focus on how parents can change what they think to sort of help out with some of these strategies. And one of the ways that parents can think differently is I think it's important for parents to kind of redefine how they think about success and performance. Because the research shows that the way we typically think about success, particularly academic success, doesn't work the way we often think. I think parents and teachers to some extent often think that like, well, my kids are going to work really hard right now, and that might kind of stress them out, but that's going to be good because eventually they'll get really good grades, and then eventually they'll get into the perfect college, and they'll get the perfect job, and they'll make money, and then they'll kind of become a success, right? And we think, yeah, sacrifice right now, maybe mental health not perfect now, but eventually future success is going to be great. That's sort of what we think. But there's lots of research that suggests it doesn't really work in the way we think, right? One of my favorite studies looked at what kids need to do to get a thing that we know we really want, which is for them to get a good job when they graduate from high school or later graduate from college and so on. And you might think it's all the usual LinkedIn skills. Maybe they got to build up their computer science or get economics or something. We don't tend to look at the amount of positive emotion our kids are having when they're young, but one researcher, Ed Diener, actually looked at that. He said, can we, from students' levels of positive emotion when they're 18, predict something about their job obtainment and things like how much they love their job and how much money they're making in their job? So he brought college students into the lab, gave them a survey about their levels of cheerfulness at age 18, and then he followed those students longitudinally, came back when they were 27 and asked, do these students have a job? Do they have a job that they like, and how much money are they making? And he found that those students who self-reported the most cheerfulness at age 18 not only had job employment, like they had actually obtained a job, they were also in jobs that earned them more money. And I think we all think that more money makes us happy, but we don't think that more positive emotion will get us more money. But study after study seems to start showing that that's the case, and not just kind of when you're an adult. The kind of positive emotions you're showing in your teenage years is actually predicting something about the money you'll make later. And you might say, like, why is that? That seems like a really strange correlation, or maybe an even worrying correlation. Maybe like HR is paying happy people more, and that's like weird. We gotta put a stop to that, right? No, it's that you earn more money when you tend to be a happier person with all these positive emotions, in part because you're more creative. You come up with more innovative solutions. One of my favorite studies looked at this in the context of medical doctors. They brought medical doctors into the lab and gave them these really hard kind of medical diagnosis problems, kind of like that old TV show House, right? Where it's like those weird kind of diseases you had to diagnose. But half the doctors got to be in a good mood ahead of time, right? They just watched some silly cat videos, so they're kind of laughing for a bit before they got these problems. What did the research find? The doctors who were in the good mood significantly solved more of the problems, right? They came up with the innovative solution. And we kind of know this, right? Like, think of the last time you were just feeling so overwhelmed or in such a bad place that you couldn't even, you're not thinking creatively, you're not thinking outside the box, you're just triaging and getting it over with, right? And the same thing is happening to our kids, right? When they're kind of feeling too overwhelmed, they're not going to do as well academically as they could because they just kind of, their emotions aren't available to allow them to think really creatively. And so again, this is our sort of messed up notion of thinking about success differently, right? Is that if we think, well, they can sacrifice now to kind of push, and all this stuff will kind of come out, we might be getting it wrong. It might be that sacrificing now is going to impede them from doing the kinds of work that they need to do to learn so they can get these kinds of successes later on. And so I think as we watch our kids struggling and they think like, oh, but the struggle's worth it because eventually, I'll get into one of these, right? I think we have to reject this notion and say, it might not work like that. We might need to think about ways to protect our students now. So that's rethinking how we define performance. And another sort of thought pattern change we need to embrace is that I think parents need to be better about embracing their kids' failure. We need to see failure as a gift. And I'm already seeing in some of your faces that this is scary. It's okay. We don't like the idea of our kids failing. And I think that this is something that we've seen resonate in a lot of the quotes that we've seen and that we've seen even in the Surgeon General's report. One of the lovely resources, I think, for parents who are kind of a little queasy about watching their kids fail is this lovely book by Jessica Lahey, The Gift of Failure, where she really talks about strategies parents can use to kind of embrace this a little bit more. And she talks about why failure can be so anxiety-provoking for parents. She notes parents, after all, are judged by their children's accomplishments, not necessarily so much by their happiness. So when our kids fail, we appropriate those failures as our own. You know, we see that bad grade that they get or they don't make the team, and it feels feels like it's us that's doing it, and that causes lots of anxiety. But she goes on to note that like if we really care about our kids' development, we kind of gotta get over that. You know, it's in order to raise competent, capable adults, she talking about her own parenting, she has to love them enough to put their learning over your happiness, their learning over your anxiety about the failures. But there's a question of like, how do we do that a little bit better? Because it's hard. You know, we kind of know that, you know, to learn how to ride the bike, we gotta let them fall off a few times, but the scraped knee feels really rough. And so how do we do that? And so one of the ways I think we can do that is to recognize what's normative in terms of how much kids should be failing and what should be the kind of normal failures out there. And I love this list that was put out by these folks, Michael Anderson and Timothy Johannesson. They have this really lovely list where they just go through, here's our top 20 things that all kids should fail at. And I like showing parents this because I think parents kind of cringe when they see this list, but this is what it looks like. Not being invited to a birthday party should happen to everybody, having your pet die, breaking something that's really valuable, working really hard on something and still getting a bad grade, having something really scary like your car break down when you're away from home, not when the parents are there, but this should happen to teenagers, seeing something that you love, like a plant you planted, die, being told, nope, can't get into that class, it's full, getting detention, missing something that was important because you're helping someone you cared about, getting in an accident. I'm watching a lot of cringy faces. That's good. We're gonna read the rest of the list. Being blamed for something you didn't do, having something canceled because you messed up, being fired, not making the team, coming in last, physical violence, right, getting hit by some other kid, getting rejected, regretting saying something that you can't take back, so you have that terrible feeling of you shouldn't have done it, not getting invited, being picked last for football. There's a lot of like, and I think it's like, it doesn't feel good to have your kids go through that. But that stuff is normative, right? One of the reasons it doesn't feel good is my guess is probably you had a lot of those things happen to you when you were kids, and those kinds of experiences helped you learn, right? It helped you learn whether it's to regulate your emotions or what you can and can't do. They were important for you. And if we take those away from our kids, we take away something important there. We need to find ways to embrace failure a little bit more. And I think one nice way to do that is to kind of value a little bit more the process rather than the product. What do I mean here? Well, this is a term that actually comes from Robin Koslowski, who's a kind of parenting expert. She has a kind of cool podcast on this. But she makes a distinction between what she calls sort of the product, which is like the outcome. So that would be something like a grade, or you finish the puzzle, you kind of achieve what you're trying to do, or you get some outcome in a kid's behavior, like they get their shoes on and they get out the door, right? Like that's the outcome you want. That's the product. But we should probably be valuing more the process, which is kind of like how we get there in the first place. So not that they got the good grade, but they learned this content that they were supposed to learn, right? Not that they finished the puzzle, but they learned the sort of resilience of pushing past, kind of feeling like you didn't know what you were doing, maybe get the satisfaction of completing it. Not necessarily the moment that you get out the door, but the fact that you become a competent kid who can get out the door every day, right? And that we don't have to have a fight all the time, right? Often we're parenting for the short term, so we just want the product to happen and go over with it. But true parenting goals should really be about the process. We should be raising these kids who kind of know how to do it on their own. And I think that's a framing switch that can sometimes help parents, is like, is this about the product or do I really care about the process? And so I think that's one way we can start to think differently. Another, though, is that you can sort of commit to what some folks like David Yeager and other researchers have called parenting for the future, right? Where your goal isn't to get any one outcome right now. It's not this test, it's not this drop-off, it's not this kind of extracurricular or this moment. What you're trying to parent for is something bigger in the future. So you're kind of prioritizing this process of learning so they do it better in the long term. That's what we're kind of shooting for.